Afternoon, everyone. We are so glad to have you back today as we embark on our fourth meeting of Kansas Early Childhood Transition Task Force. That's a mouthful. Today could be our most important conversation, and as we move toward the goal of a final report for December.
That's right, Sam. And so, good afternoon, everyone. It's glad to have everybody. Good to have everybody together again. So, you may recall that in August, when we had our last meeting, we all identified work groups that we would like to participate in. Those work groups included programmatic movements, transition logistics, and metrics and data. We have met over the interim. Each one of those work groups met, and for the purpose of bringing us forward final recommendations today.
Right. So today we have a simple agenda, but it is meaty. And first, we're going to hear from each of the three working groups and each group will present their recommendation, and which you've each received a draft by email, and hopefully have had a chance to review that. But we'll have time for understanding that verbally, and then we'll have time for questions. So we're going to take a brief moment to discuss each set and open the floor to any additions, deletions, edits that we might suggest for the group. And ultimately, we'll ask that the task force take action in adopting these recommendations today as our final guidance to the Hunt Institute, which will be responsible for compiling our report to Governor Kelly.
So because this is really the heart of the task force work, this is why we are all brought together. We wanted to carve out a lot of time today for conversations this afternoon. If we don't need all of the time, we'll let you reclaim part of your afternoon. And so, but I also want us to focus on really having meaningful conversation. But again, if we get done early, then that is great too. This is definitely where the rubber meets the road as far as our recommendations go. So we want to take the time to work through questions and issues as needed. But again, should we get done early, then we can certainly adjourn. So with that, why don't we get started with our first presentation from the Programmatic Movements Work Group, and David Jordan will be representing that group for presentation. David.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. The program work group had a really robust discussion, and we're happy to present the recommendations today. So under the first recommendation, 1.1, the subgroup recommended that a unified early childhood entity should co-locate a variety of programs encompassing childcare, early childhood grants, and services, and home visiting. And all of the subsequent recommendations will be in support of that larger recommendation of co-locating current services within one entity to better serve children and providers within the state. Currently, in recommendation 1.2, we recognize current state programs impact the child care delivery are spread across the Kansas Department of Children and Families, DCF, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, KDHE, and the Kansas Children's Cabinet and Trust Fund. All identified programs relating to child care should be realigned under one entity to ensure adequate collaboration and drive statewide strategies on child care. And I think this sentiment really drove our thinking, boosting collaboration and driving strategies to improve services. The new entity should serve as the central point for improving the child care system across the state. Within these recommendations is the recommendation that the child care assistance and child care quality programs and the child care, which both are located within DCF, and child care licensing, which is located within KDHE, be co-located and moved to this new entity that we discussed earlier in our recommendations. We also recognize the need for transition planning so that families could have easy access to these subsidies to ensure affordability during the times of transition, recognizing this will impact technology, service delivery, and other interactions between providers, families, and the state, and made recommendations there should be some considerations for an MOU to make sure that that transition happens smoothly. Moving on to the next recommendation, which is related to the Children's Cabinet. the Kansas Children's Cabinet and Trust Fund, their programming and operations should be embedded within this new entity. So along the same lines of moving child care licensing and child care subsidy into the new entity, we would be merging the cabinet's services into the new entity to ensure that there's a comprehensive delivery system for all children. The cabinet would retain its designation as the state's Early Childhood Advisory Council in accordance with Federal Head Start Readiness Act. And the cabinet would retain its position and statutory power related to the Kansas Endowment for Youth, the KEY Act, and administering those programs, and the board would have the oversight over that program. The Kansas, under these recommendations in 1.3.3, the Children Cabinet Board would not have direct oversight of other programming administered by this new entity, specifically but not limited to the management of child care subsidy, child care quality, child care licensing, and home visiting. And I think this is just important to point out. Moving on to 1.4. Currently, home visiting programs are administered and or funded by the Kansas Department of Children and Families, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, the Kansas State Department of Education, and the Children's Cabinet Trust Fund. The new entity should include the co-location of home visiting programs currently administered by these four agencies. The goal is to create a continuum of care rather than the current fragmented approach that currently exists with regards to home visiting within the state. The one entity would provide oversight and a vision for home visiting to lead to enhanced collaboration among multiple providers and offer an opportunity to look at financing. The programs should be consolidated, include the Healthy Families America, which is currently administered by DCF, Parents as Teachers, which is currently administered by KSDE, the Maternal and Child Health Home Visiting Program, MICV, and which is currently administered by KDHE, and the Maternal Infant Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, MICV, which is also administered by KDHE. So these programs would move to the new entity. Head Start program and operational support currently resides within the Kansas Department of Children and Families, and that should be transitioned to the new consolidated entity as well. The programs that should be consolidated under one entity include the Head Start Collaboration Office, the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership, and the Kansas Early Head Start Home Visitation. Moving on, programs primarily focused on health outcomes should remain within the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, but structures there should be put in place to ensure adequate collaboration exists between the health-focused programs and the early childhood services administered by the consolidated agency. Two sub-recommendations include the new entity should include appointing a dedicated administrator to work across programs and state agencies to ensure alignment between home visiting and these types of health-oriented programs that reside within KDHE and other agencies, and that KDHE should consider employing a leadership level professional to oversee early childhood issues within Medicaid to ensure alignment and coordinated financing of services. Moving on, preschool programs housed in the Kansas Department of Education should remain in their current locations, given the prevalence of these programs being administered by local unified school districts, and some elements of their funding are provided through the school finance formula. And finally, programs primarily focused on child welfare, such as child care protective services, foster care, adoption, should remain at DCF, including this also includes child prevention programs and grants funded through the Families First program. However, these structures should be put in place to ensure adequate collaboration that exists between child welfare focused programs, early childhood services, and early childhood services administered by the new entity. The consolidated entity should consider appointing a centralized administrator to work across program types and state agencies to ensure alignment between home visiting and these types of child welfare, and child welfare programs. That concludes the presentation of the programmatic recommendations. To sum this up, it's really looking at how can we focus on strengthening service delivery, collaboration, and alignment, moving the child care licensing, child care subsidy, and home visiting into the new entity, while also ensuring collaboration between KDHE, Medicaid, DCF, and KSD on core services that should remain there. So thank you.
Thank you, David, for giving us an overview of the recommendations. So do we have comments and questions from anybody in terms of the recommendations for this area? Yes.
May I ask my question?
Oh, of course. Yes, please.
Thank you. So on 1.4, can you just give me a picture of what the co-location of home visiting programs would look like?
In terms of, thank you, Senator. And others, please feel free to jump in. I think there's recognition that home visiting programs are sort of spread across different agencies. I think the vision would be that this new entity would have responsibility for oversight of these programs, reporting on grants, as well as administering the program and coordinating funding services, and also looking for efficiencies. Though I think it's others could probably add some additional details.
There is duplication of funding and effort. Each of us have grants and contracts in place to deliver the services, and I think we're at 9 different models of home visiting that are used by a whole host of actual providers. So this is just about coordination of efforts so that we don't duplicate and create the burden of multiple application processes for the providers themselves, and that we can focus on the creation of a continuum of care so that the right prescription for each family, if you will, the right type of service is identified and families are connected and offered the appropriate level of service. So some of them are universal and others are very directly related to specific needs.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Other questions or comments?
I just want to comment on 1.6.2. I think the Division of Healthcare Finance, and I guess this could be a technicality, I think because Medicaid is split between 2 agencies, then there might be some consideration of which side of Medicaid that would go on, that development of that position and whatnot. So I think the same goal, but just does that reside in DCF versus the Medicaid side? So that's a housekeeping item. Thank you.
Commissioner, would you have specific wording recommendations there? Yes.
So I don't know if you gave any thought to that part of that. Again, I don't have an issue. It's more of a, where does it reside at the end of it?
Secretary Howard, I don't have strong feelings either. I think I guess the language would really be the focus about a strong leadership position focused on these activities, maybe not calling it out specifically within Medicaid. It could be Medicaid or DCF, but I think the focus is on, if I understand the recommendation, the focus is on optimizing financing, particularly in the Medicaid arena.
Yes. So maybe just for the Medicaid program instead of specifically DHCF, maybe, if that helps. Thank you.
And I think that was the thrust of the recommendation, Secretary Howard and Secretary Stanek, is to explore ways to leverage Medicaid dollars to support early childhood development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good comments. Yes, ma'am.
We had one piece around recommendation 1.7, which refers to preschool programming, where we were considering what the scope of this task force is, and I think would appreciate some conversation around whether it's appropriate to include here or not. I think that's something that we've heard a lot over the last several months, is that our existing state system is perhaps more complicated than it needs to be and is too reliant on competitive grant applications. The Kansas Preschool Pilot is an $8.3 million allocation that's made up of both Children's Initiatives Fund and TANF funds, and I don't think that the solution is just shifting that level of funding from one agency to another. But I do think that we have some opportunity to consider some of the lessons that we've learned from the Kansas Preschool Pilot since it was first established in 2006, and ask ourselves whether there's a more efficient and streamlined way of financing preschool and supplementing our existing preschool in the state of Kansas. Some easy pieces that come to mind from my perspective would be enhancing the school finance formula around how we currently fund preschool students to fully fund students who attend full day rather than capping them at a 1/2 student or 0.5 FTE. But that's obviously a bit bigger than just determining who is responsible for what. So I'd love some conversation or some other perspectives on whether or not that's an appropriate piece to recommend here, or whether we just want to keep that idea on the back burner. Should we have appetite in the future to streamline and improve preschool in Kansas?
I'm going to take a stab at this, but if looking at it as a layperson, you're saying the committee's not recommending to move it today. Mm-hmm. You're saying, should we at least put a spot on the map down the road so that somebody would address it in the future? Is that kind of the crux of the question? Any thoughts, feedback with that?
This is just a comment, really, from the perspective that I live in, which is a funder perspective. The general public does not differentiate between preschool and early childhood education or child care. So I think I can understand why Amanda's asking us to consider that, because to the populace, it's all when, I mean, we routinely put grants out for child care and get preschool applications for them. So it's a good question. I don't have an answer for it.
Would it be appropriate then to make the recommendation that 2 years down the line, this entity would try to address this particular issue once the transition, maybe the recommendation of the transition or the transition has happened, to keep it, to put a placeholder there, or is there another better suggestion to make a recommendation that we'd carry forward? A thought?
I would just point out the current school finance formula has a sunset date of 2027. Needs to be, God protect us, it needs to be reauthorized or renovated, or updated. So it does feel like there is an appropriate time to address issues, not meaning to kick cans down the road, but I would echo the sentiment that the current system, as we have worked in the last several years to coordinate between the grants given for the Kansas Preschool Pilot Program and the grants we give at the cabinet for the Early Childhood Block Grant, we first work to deduplicate effort and make sure that the right source of the funds was going to grantees. So fewer school districts being funded through our Early Childhood Block Grant and more of them being funded through the preschool pilot. It is still, as Amanda pointed out, half of that preschool pilot funding is TANF dollars that get sent to KSDE, and the rest is our tobacco funds that through the CIF are a line item for the program. So it is definitely worth looking at stability for the program. I know we've looked at how many school districts now. We're about 20 some years into the pilot, and we have
about
60 school districts receiving grants. And we have, overall, we've looked at how many districts offer preschool programming.
265.
265. So it's a topic for conversation. I don't know. I know we maybe we'll get to a section of the recommendations at the end that are other ideas that don't fit the task force specific goal of addressing the organizational structure. And I think it's worthwhile to think about whether we support adding a point in that section to look at.
As a program who has had Kansas preschool pilot funding, but also worked with school districts with their preschool funding, it has definitely been quite the challenge to be able to create the full day funding for our children, knowing that we had two different reports, two different funding streams. How do we make sure that they get the full day care, that the actual care and education that they need? So, Amanda, I do appreciate the idea, instead of doing a 0.5 FTE, that we actually fund full day preschool programming and whatnot, as opposed to using, the Kansas preschool pilot funding, or whatnot. And we laugh and jokingly call it pilot funding because pilots typically don't last 20 plus years. And so, but with that, I can say that I definitely understand the need for, and I think that, Melissa, I do like the idea of maybe creating like a different line that might not be about the consolidation or whatnot, but are there additional recommendations that once this entity is created that they look at? And one of them perhaps is the funding structure for preschool and what that means for full day programming.
I want to add on to what Amanda said at the very beginning. The first part of her comments were about our initial conversations about how local folks have to patch things together to pull it off. And that, you're solely dependent upon that happening if you're a family. So this is, to me, an example of, yes, I agree with the recommendation that it stays where it is, but I do hope that we look at a 1.0 FTE for approved pre-K programs. That also, please know, in that right now, that does not keep a school district from collaborating with a qualified pre-K partner in the community. And so many years ago, we were very concerned about wiping out what was in our communities with the school district, with more leverage. The way that the procedures are in place now, and not only encourages collaboration with community partners, but in my opinion, oftentimes ends up with a better product. So I hope that we don't just say, look at it again in 2 years. I hope that we specifically talk about the funding component as it feels like at the local level.
Senator Bumpkin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the conversation about this. Certainly appreciate the conversation about funding. But I think to put things in perspective, over 5 years ago, we took kindergarten from a 0.5 funding to a 1.0. And at that time, the argument of the districts, at least the concern of the districts, was that they were using at-risk money to pay for that other 0.5 for kindergarten. The interesting thing is when we flipped that switch to fund kindergarten as 1.0, then what we didn't see was better utilization of at-risk funds. In fact, what we saw was an increase of abuse of at-risk funds. We saw abuse of at-risk funds. So I think that we would want to be careful when we talk about, well, let's just raise it from 0.5 to 1. That has been edging close to $1 billion of extra money that went into our schools when we made that change to kindergarten. And again, we're not seeing better utilization of those at-risk funds. So base aid has gone up. And part of my concern, quite frankly, is I appreciate the comments made about collaborate with preschools already in existence that aren't run by the school districts. But it's been my experience that when there's a new price tag and it's the 1.0 as opposed to the 0.5, there will be chasing to get those extra dollars. Not so much to expand services, not so much to improve needs. And I think for now, it would be complicated to remove preschool from the Department of Ed. I quite frankly don't think that that would be the worst thing to happen, is to move it. But for that to work, I think that we need to pay more attention to 1.4 and what was described as we have 9 different models. And that's what is and isn't happening with those home visits. And I have to say that quite frankly, when I am looking at this, the lens has changed for me with the recent murder of 5-year-old Zoe Felix. And so as we are looking at this and we look at the 9 different models and the different programs that are already existing, how did that happen? And what other children similar to Zoe? No one's made a visit to. There isn't a home visit. And how do we work to protect and serve very vulnerable families? So when I look at 1.4, I understand there's that need for consistent funding. But when I look at 1.4, home visits is a hand, and you have all these different fingers. So how are those fingers going to be communicating and literally touching each other so that the child is taken care of? The needs of the child and the family are taken care of. Because as we have this growing community of tent families, I don't think anyone's visiting them. And they are growing in Topeka, in Lawrence, absolutely growing in Wichita, and other smaller communities. And so I think we like to think of that structure of the school districts, and we have these different programs, but I think we have to be realistic about where are people today and in the future. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, Senator Dietrich.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. So part, I think, of the issue with the at-risk funds is we just don't have some structures in place that we need and some guardrails and some parameters. So if we're talking about how we expend those dollars, I think if we have some guardrails on there and we have a little bit more targeted approach and some expectations, that would be helpful. And so when we're, and I want to mention the home visiting piece. I think that is a very valuable part of any of our early childhood programs, whether they're preschool or Head Start or whatever. So I think part of this, if there's any way we can add some, guidelines or expectations for what we need to do here, that would make a world of difference, because we're sitting around a table and we know what we would like to see happen, but how do we guarantee that unless we put that in writing so that everybody is aware of what those expectations are for them, their agency, the reorganization, the funding. So I think that's all a very important part of this. Just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Senator.
Well, thank you all. I think that covered everything. And I think we did try to get at it, not to belabor it, in 1.4, recognizing the need for a real a vision for home visiting and a continuum of care where every child could have a home visit and it's the most appropriate home visit, and it doesn't matter where you live or how it's funded, but that we're serving that child and that family in a way that aids their development and their learning and their health. So hopefully it came through, and I think we will turn it over to the chairs.
So coming back, I want to revisit the point. I wanted to know if we need to make an additional recommendation to that. That I think my perspective is that we'd want to be careful about expanding the scope beyond what we're charged to do. and related to, we're not talking, I believe, about changing the duties of any individual agency within the programs as they exist, but coordinating them. As what I've understood the committee did is to say, for these things, these are the things that ought to be combined. These are the things that we could see potential problems with combining under a singular agency at this time, with the exception of the one leadership role within, help me out, DHC, would be the only individual staffing change that the committee recommended. And so with that, we would probably need somebody to make a motion that we needed to add to it for us to vote on at the end, or we could take all three at once. But I didn't come away clear with a recommendation that we had consensus around related to your suggestion. So I think we need to either get a suggestion on the table that we're ready to adopt, or we say we need to put a pin in that for a later time.
So if our scope of what we are, if what we are interested in doing is taking existing programs and not making major changes to them, right now we allocate $8.3 million of funding to the Kansas Preschool Pilot Grant Program, and I don't hear any feedback that we would like to eliminate that or replace it with something else. So I would recommend that we maintain administration of that at the Kansas State Department of Education, because as we're administering that program, we're asking school districts to share with us the amount of funding that they already receive through the school finance formula, so that we can then see what the gap is between the amount that their program costs and the amount that they already receive for preschool. I think it would be difficult for a different organization to approach the grants in that way. But in the future, if anybody is interested in a pretty straightforward idea to streamline administration of preschool financing in Kansas, we've got an idea that could work pretty well. So,
I'm sorry. Put a pin in it. Yeah, it does. Okay. Oh,
did you have
David,
one more?
Please. No.
I think the recommendations could move forward as currently presented without an amendment.
I'm sorry, do we need language to amend to deal with the Medicaid, the position?
Oh, Secretary Stanek, do we need to swap out healthcare finance for Medicaid to be
I think,
precise?
I think it would just be a cleanup. Just substitute DHCF with
Medicaid.
The Medicaid program. Yes, thanks.
Okay.
Secretary, I want to just make sure that I'm tracking with you. So on item 1.6.2, am I understanding correctly that we would remove the language that says in the Division of Healthcare Finance?
Yeah, I think it needs to say in the Medicaid program, because DHCF, the Medicaid program is split into two areas, and we could worry about who does what later with the hiring of the position. So that's all. It's. I'm sorry I didn't catch that ahead of the meeting.
I just want to make sure it's.
So,
and Amanda, your issue does not entail any change to the draft as presented here?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, the only other thing that maybe I would bring up, just that you all will recall in the last two meetings, you all have had conversation around sort of the political reality and the merits of a new agency versus an existing agency, and would just flag for you all that I think the work group did a very careful job of describing this as a consolidated entity, and leaving that question a little bit open-ended for the legislature and for Governor Kelly.
Noted. I thought it was very craftily and expertly worded to achieve the goal of this group. I'd like to take your recommendation as a motion to edit, if that's appropriate, Secretary.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. Would there be a second to that motion?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Well, with that as the edit, I think then we might be ready to take, I'd prefer maybe we take these one at a section at a time, so we don't have to remember all three of these recommendations and what the edits are. So this might be the appropriate time to take a motion for this first section with the structure. Would there be somebody? David, would you be willing to make that motion on behalf of your team?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Mr.
All
Chair. I would make a motion that the task force adopt recommendation 1, and that we establish or we utilize a unified early childhood entity, which should co-load a variety of programs encompassing childcare, early childhood grants, and services, and home visiting.
Thank you. Is there a second? Thank
Second.
you, Representative. All right. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Oh, thank you. Oh, was there? I apologize. Senator?
That's okay. This can be a follow-up. As we are going through this, are we going to identify where new positions are being created or would need to be created? And also, what areas, like the program should be consolidated under one entity, and again, that's 1.42. Do we have a scatter map that shows, when we are looking at our state, where all 4 exist, where just 1 exists and the other 3 don't, and things like that? And are we also going to identify which components could perhaps go ahead and start moving, not waiting for actual legislation and the formation? Are we going to be doing that so that it's a meaningful document for legislators to consider?
Around the table.
I think we'd be happy to include that in the final report. I would rely a little bit on all of you, particularly agency leaders, on what are those areas that might be able to begin moving through executive action or just through the initiative of the agencies.
It seems like some of those things would be to follow with the transition plan as well as the metrics that are going to be developed to monitor success. Oh, thank you.
I was just going to offer that yes, for the forward-thinking transition planning, that's a thing that will flow out of the actions of this. But I think we can help deliver. I can speak for the cabinet. We can help deliver the map of where things exist and some of that background information that will help us have there's a lot of this that already exists that can be brought to bear so that there is knowledge being used for the transition planning.
Senator, there was conversation previously about are there some things that we've identified that aren't let's wait for 2 years to make it happen versus things that we think we can actually effectively do now that's going to benefit children, families, and providers. And so I think that was something that was also echoed early on. And so thank you for that.
And a reminder as well that the numbers of FTEs, the statutory authority, all of that will be was already included in that initial document that we pulled together, but will be a part of the report as well.
Just one more thought related to the FTEs. Part of my hope out of this is that it may be a brand new FTE that needs to be added, but part of the hope is that we will realize some FTE savings, the efficiencies, and that we can redirect positions to fulfill some of these goals. So I would say we need to have some careful analysis over staffing from that lens.
Yes, and I would absolutely concur. If you are moving, consolidating, it is going to show a shift or reduction of some and creation of new and different. I think that's helpful for legislators to see how that flow occurs.
Yeah. It makes perfect sense with the goal of ours to be bringing more value to the child, right? And putting more resources in front of the families that support those children, for sure. Great comment. Other discussion? Okay, we'll proceed with the vote. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed? All right. Great. So we'll move on to the second set of recommendations, and this is the Transition Logistics Working Group. And Monica, I believe you are going to report out on behalf
Give
of your
it my
group.
best shot.
Great.
It's just kind of a tiny subject.
Easy work, right?
So I'm going to start by saying when our group met, I felt like we had a really good conversation, and we were very straightforward with each other and talked through some of the things that we were all thinking, and then moved forward with some general ideas that we concurred on. And I appreciate the way that this is written. I'm not going to try to veer from it very far without reading to you step by step, but I feel it's really important because there are a lot of details in here that I think may address some of the questions about the big picture. So with that in mind, I'm going to point you towards 2.1. The recommendation is Kansas should, that sounded like a game show, didn't it? The recommendation is, sorry about that. You can tell I'm a kindergarten teacher and I read like I am. Kansas should streamline its early childhood governance structure by consolidating early childhood care and education services into a single state entity, reforming our coordinated system into a consolidated or creation model. So the idea of, if, leaving it a little bit open here, that if a single agency isn't the answer, that we can indeed be smart and work within what we have and consolidate for that bigger goal. How to do that? Governor Kelly should consider, no glasses, both consolidating services into an existing agency or creating a new agency or entity. Both options should be considered, as consolidation is needed regardless of what form it takes. Everybody agrees on that. 2.12, the consolidated entity should be located within the executive branch, be led by an executive administrator, and operate under the jurisdiction of the governor. The consolidated entity should appear on the state's organization chart and serve as its own fiscal agent. The administrator of the consolidation should report to the governor and serve at their pleasure. The administrator shall either be considered a permanent member of the governor's cabinet or be elevated to serve in the cabinet at the governor's discretion. Governor Kelly and the executive branch should work together with the Kansas legislature to determine what method and mechanism of consolidation is preferable and will ensure successful implementation of the task force recommendations. So that's really the meat of it right there. That's the bigger picture. And then we move into 2.2, which addresses the timeline issue. The timeline's hard to nail down, isn't it? But I feel like this is a great start. The enactment period, legal authorization, would be between the period of January through May of 2024, followed by an initial transition preparation, which would begin in June 24, August 24, and then a transition period. Implementation team created in September 1 of 24, followed by a new entity department establishment the following July 2025, with a complete consolidation plan by July 1, 2026. During the enactment period, Governor Kelly should work with the Kansas legislature to determine the best method for consolidation and preferred form. Between the enactment and fiscal year 25, initial transition operations should commence. That addresses a bit what we were talking about earlier. See recommendation 2.4 for details. Moving along, throughout fiscal 25, transition planning should be led by a transition director and interagency advisory team, as outlined in 2.5. On July 1 of 2025, the entity leadership should be identified, appointed, and installed to oversee the operations of the new entity and continue the work for transitioning programs and services. By July 1 of 2025, a transition timeline for all programs should be established to identify those programs to be transferred effectively July 1 of 25. And those that would, during the course of state fiscal year 26, no later than June 30 of 2026. So kind of two different groups. By July 1 of 26, all programs identified for co-location in this report should be transferred to the consolidated entity and administered by that entity. Moving into 2.3, Governor Kelly should utilize fiscal 25 budget to provide seed funding that invests in the proper transition of services rather than formally reallocating funding streams attached to specific programs in the consolidated entity. Funding for programs in the entity, inclusive of additional labor cost, for example, the temporary overtime outside contracting services, should be included in the fiscal 26 budget to allow for additional time to unravel the funding streams and ensure adequate programmatic transfer, allowing the consolidated entity to be operational at the beginning of fiscal 26 or July 1, 2025. That addresses the startup money. We had quite a conversation around that. On 2.4, following the enactment of the consolidated entity, the governor's office should initiate transition activities by searching for a transition director as outlined in 2.5, below identifying agency consolidation leads and initiating consolidation procedures prior to July 1 of 2024. So that's kind of the who part of it. 2.5, the governor's office should hire a transition director beginning July 1 of 24 to provide strategic policy oversight, serve as the interagency convener, and manage the day-to-day logistics of the agency consolidation. The transition director should be experienced in operational mergers and have an understanding of state government systems, direct state government operations, operational merger and reorganization experience is strongly preferred. This was discussed quite a bit, and lessons learned from other states were involved in this recommendation. To narrow that down a bit more, the transition director and interagency team comprised, to assist the transition director, an interagency team comprised of current staff from Health and Environment, DCF, the Cabinet, and the Department of Education should be impaneled to support the technical and operational elements of the agency consolidation. This group should be tasked with assisting the transition director, overseeing the integration of information systems, data, payroll, finances, and any other operational systems needed to the new entity. Each current state agency should also identify relevant program leadership to collaborate with the transition director on the programming movement. Together, the interagency transition team, comprised of both program and operational staff, shall serve to support the transition director and implement the transition prior to July 1 of 25. Adequate funding should be secured in 25 to hire a transition director and effectively support activities outlined in the recommendation. And the transition director and the interagency transition team should hold a series of town hall meetings. One moment, please. With the program staff who are affected by the consolidation of services and ensure they have an opportunity to provide feedback to the transition, build on the culture of the consolidated entity, and support the development of a collaborative administration. The transition director should not be tapped to become the permanent administrator of the consolidated entity. Once it becomes operational July 1, 25, the transition director should be held accountable for the transition process. New leadership should be given the ability to enter into the consolidated entity with a wide latitude. If additional services are required to assist the transition, the governor's office should consider combining the transition director with outside consulting services to create a collaborative to support this process. And then another recommendation, those were weedy details, but those were all things that have come up in our conversation and do seem to be, based on other states' efforts, very key to have in writing and to articulate. The governor's office should initiate a search process for the consolidated entity's executive leadership throughout 2024, ensuring that an administrator is identified and hired as early into the transition process as possible. Once the entity becomes operational and leadership is installed on July 1 of 25, programs should begin moving into the consolidated entity over the course of fiscal 26. The transition should be complete and the consolidated entity should be fully operational by July 1 of 26. This is important, this next part, not in bold, but still incredibly important. No interruptions in service should occur during the transition planning or transfer of programs into the consolidated entity. And finally, any necessary memorandums of understanding should be adopted during the transition. So that was a lot of words, but important words, I think, to articulate what we all came into this room knowing would be as they say, the devil in the details. So this is what the group has put forward. And if I can't answer questions, I bet all the other nice people can that we're on the call with.
Very good. We'll open it up for questions. And that was definitely a lot of heavy lifting that happened there, but a lot of attention to detail for sure. And so, Melissa.
Thank you. So I think this is directed for Hunt. Dan, my overall feedback, I served on this working group. We have two formal versions of this work. One is the consolidation model and the other is the creation model. And because we're trying to create a set of recommendation that leaves flexibility to work with our lawmakers to come to terms, this is wordsmithing, but I think it matters. The term consolidation is used throughout this set of recommendations, and I don't think it's being used to indicate the particular model being chosen. And I think it's very confusing. So my feedback, and I can resend because it's peppered throughout this document, it's not just one place. We either should refer to this as the new entity or the realignment rather than the term consolidation, because we don't know what form that realignment will take, but we do know we're talking about realigning this. And I don't want to leave the impression that we're leaning one way or the other with the document and the recommendations as written. So
Yeah, just as a little bit of context for everybody, sort of harkening back to our first meeting, you may recall that I had presented around 3 different models that states have taken. Sort of a coordinated approach, which is what Kansas is operating under currently, where the different agencies do their best to work together. There are consolidated approaches in the states where the states have chosen to basically consolidate those programs into an existing state agency. And then the third category that we talked about was creation of a new state agency. And I think Melissa's raising the point of sort of not confusing consolidate as listed all throughout here as one of those 3 options. I think the easiest way to me, Melissa, would be maybe to just make fewer references. I think there was a reference to consolidation and creation in the first set of recommendations, just to clarify that it could be either into an existing entity or into a new entity. But I think we can play with that language and maybe minimize the use of those as kind of formal models.
Yeah, and I actually don't see my feedback on 2.5.6. I really was stuck on the transition director should be accountable for the transition process. I think the transition director should be, I think we're trying to delineate responsibilities. I mean, accountability to me is built into inhabiting the position, but I think it's the responsibility for the transition side as opposed to the actual implementation side. So I had recommended that wordsmithing there as well.
Any further questions or comments? Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, my question had to do with that, holding someone accountable. And really what what are we looking for with being the individual being held accountable? Is it staying within the time frame and the schedule that had been put in place? Is it needing to rely on outside consultants? And I think that when we mention accountability, we do need to have those guardrails there as far as what specifically are we looking for. And when we include earlier that the governor may need to bring in consultants, I think we need to really kind of, again, those are guardrail issues, because I can see just the transition becoming more and more expensive and moving off track of any type of a time frame. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Baumgartner. Yes, Melissa.
To tie on to that thought, my question would be, would it behoove us to define some of that here in these recommendations or in scope of work and, the kinds of agreements that get put in place if these recommendations come to pass? Where is your comfort level?
If I might, Madam Chair, I want accountability spelled out in the legislation. I want some clawback options, which, I mean, we're not going to RFP this, but I think that there needs to be accountability, and it's going to have to go above the transition director, because essentially the transition director, do I understand, reports to the governor. Is that who the transition director reports to?
I believe that was the intent. I don't think, Molly, I don't think we got that into that many details.
Right.
And I get what you're saying. It's like to spell out even more, right? And so I would say, and committee can correct me here, I feel like what we tried to put down was, it wasn't a complete guardrail. We put the white lines down on the side of the road, but we didn't actually build the metal things, right? And we did the white lines based on what we had learned from other places, but also what kind of felt logical, as far as step by step by step. That transition director, one thing that we discussed was just like we discussed in this committee the very first time, all the little things about legal stuff and IT and all that. We felt like that person was really doing the hard work there. And then that team from each agency, while it says assist, that leader from each agency, to me, that kind of felt like, okay, everybody's got to keep this moving. So I get what you're saying is who's accountable. I feel like it is this position, but that accountability is defined by the governor as it really, and with information from that team. That was my take on it. Did anybody else feel differently? I think you had a discussion about agency work.
Yeah, I did. I also want to point, we call him admin in 2.1, and then we call him transition director in the rest of the form.
is I think that's the same position. So we probably need to clear that language up a little bit as well. Is it different? Okay. Then I would say the answer is no. The transition director is going to report to the admin.
I don't think the admin gets hired. It doesn't get created.
Okay. We have some more work to do.
Senator Petty actually had her hand up. And so Senator, did you have a question or comment?
Thank you. So I had a comment about the conversation earlier concerning, as Melissa Brooker brought up about the word consolidation. And I'm just wondering if, and this would probably go to Dan with Hunt, in the programmatic movements in 1.1, where they referred to the unified early childhood entity, it seems like that's a broad enough phrase that could be used in our I was on the transition logistics committee, that could be used there instead of consolidating. And to me, it takes in all of these areas. So I don't know, Dan, what you think, or Melissa, I know we were talking about wordsmithing, but I'm wondering if that phrase or that reference in 1.1 could fit into 2.1 and would help to alleviate the use of that word consolidated.
Senator, I think that makes good sense to me.
Monica, I don't, you might comment what you think.
I think I'm still struggling with the consolidation verbiage too. And I think what you're saying makes sense.
I think that would eliminate the confusion I think that Melissa had raised about, whether we're talking about consolidation as a verb or consolidated as a specific model of governance.
Agreed.
Can you say it again, Pat?
Oh, sorry. I was just referring back to 1.1, the unified early childhood entity, and that seems to be a phrase that could be used within the 2.1 in place of by consolidating early childhood care and education services. It seems like it could be Kansas should streamline its early childhood governance structure. A unified early childhood entity into, well, and it we already have there in a single state entity, so it just remove that and into become a unified early childhood entity, and take out the words consolidated wherever they're at, and that would be one of them.
That would certainly address my concerns.
As we talked in our group, there was some discussion about presumption, right? And using that if we didn't have maybe legislative support for a new entity, was consolidation a word that was acceptable? Am I remembering this right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So those are, I don't know. It's all how people take in the information, but I do think the committee was clear. We're open to just looking at consolidating things to make them, for that purpose of making them easier for families. So
Consolidating services.
Consolidating services. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I think I've lived through too many school consolidation conversations. I'm starting to sweat, so I'm going to be quiet.
Yeah, I think that's just it. I think there's a lot of weight to the term consolidation. I think the point we're trying to convey, we are not actually dreaming up new and different programs or services. These all exist. They're just scattered in a lot of places, and we're looking to unify them and align them in a single location to the extent possible as outlined in the program section, so that administration can be more streamlined, more focused, more accountable. Programs receiving funding, it will be easier to administer and ensure expectations are met across the board if it's coming under the supervision of a single entity. So I like the ideas of realigning. I like the idea of unifying. I think consolidation is its own thing. And it does technically mean the same thing, but I would prefer we steer clear of that term for a lot of reasons.
Yes. So I would concur with that consolidation, especially when you're talking about school systems and rural communities and things like that. It's a bit of a hot word and not always in a positive way. So, but consolidating services works. I love the word unification. That seems like a good term. And now I'm going to ask a question that maybe I shouldn't ask, but I'm wondering if it's part of the work of the task force. Everything we're talking about today, which I totally think is appropriate and support, is, offering the opportunity for the legislature to look at a couple of options to fulfill an important need in the state. So one is what the governor initially asked us for, which was the creation of a new cabinet level position and agency. And the other was maybe if that we felt like is not something that could probably survive, then bringing services together in a unified fashion to fulfill the same. Do we as a task force, is it our responsibility to recommend where that would land if it becomes a unification of services in an existing agency? That's my question.
I would say the easy answer to that is it's up to the determination of the legislature. Whatever the task force recommends is not going to be rubber stamped by the legislature by any means. And in the conversations through the committee process, committee hearings, then amendments on the floor, and then whatever the course may take, it's going to be the legislature who decides if we're going to realign it into an existing agency, where that existing agency will be. Or even if the creation of a new agency. I would say no. It's outside the purview of the task force, since the legislature will actually decide. And I do have a question when I have a moment, though.
Any further questions or comments? Oh, Troy, sorry.
All right, thank you. I was going through the timeline, and I apologize. I was asking Director Rucker if we actually discussed this specific timeline, because I was in a Medicaid leadership meeting at the same time we were having the transition task force meeting, so I was in and out of the conversations, and she didn't really recall this specified time frame, but we did talk about a time frame. And so I'm just looking at this as far as how the legislative process or the budget process works. So we're talking about the enactment period and the legal authorization Is that just basically saying that the legislature is going to authorize the creation or the start of the transitioning process?
That's the way I took it. I went back and looked at my scratching from that meeting, and I wrote down very similar numbers. I think this is more detailed, of course, than what we talked about. What I recall is we walked it backwards, realistically walked it backwards, and that enactment period. That was, I think, the premise that it's going to take the legislature all session to figure this out. And then once it's passed, the budget's passed, then things start rolling. That's what I
Well, and then when
understood.
we get into initial transition preparation, June, let's say we are
So really
proactive.
July 1.
Well, and that goes to my next point. On the next page under 2.3, I believe, where it says Governor Kelly should utilize the fiscal year 25 budget to provide seed funding. Why couldn't that be in the current budget that we're in fiscal year 24 to get the process started? We can make an addendum to the budget. And then that way, when we're starting on July 1, 2024, you already have the funding in fiscal year 2024 to get it started. So if you want to start, how does that work? Initiating the consolidation we've already talked about consolidation. Now we might change that word. But if you want to start that on July 1, you may have already had the transitional director appointed, assigned, hired, whatever the case may be, to start that on July 1. If you do it in fiscal year 2025, the funding does not kick in until July 1, 2024. So I would say to expedite it, because I mean, as Senator Baumgartner mentioned, we have critical needs across the state. I think the sooner we can get this started and activated, the better the state and the children across the state of Kansas will be. So I would say the seed funding would need to be in the fiscal year 2024 budget.
What number is that, Troy?
2.3.
Representative Waymaster, and just to make sure I'm understanding, so that would entail, I mean, that budget is presumably already passed.
Yes, it went to
So
effect July
it would
1,
entail
2023. Yes.
An amendment to the existing budget.
We do it every year. And it usually passes the legislature in March and signed in April.
Thank you, Representative Waymaster. Any other questions, comments, thoughts for discussion?
I just wanted to go back to 2.5.6. Did we clear that up? Do we need to wordsmith that now as a group? I apologize for my confusion. We were very intentional as a group that we needed a transition director because change is difficult and this process is going to be difficult. We wanted that person to be able to come in, make the difficult changes, and then be able to step down and let the new director take over. So I do feel like they would be reporting to the governor, and that should probably also be stated. That is not very clear. So I do feel like 2.5 has some wordsmithing. I just don't know how detailed we need to get as a task force today.
My sense is that anyone from the work group, please feel free to correct me. My sense is that the administrator, the executive administrator, identified in 2.1.2 is that transition director. Am I wrong there?
We're saying that's two different roles. We're saying that they're going to come in after the transition director has fulfilled their requirements, because the transition director is going to shake things up, cause a lot of changes, potentially be, viewed in a potentially bad light because change is hard. And then they would come in afterwards with everything in place.
Agency director, the
Yes.
permanent agency.
Yes, the
director.
admin is the permanent agency director.
In 2.1. Okay.
Yes, I had the same confusion, Dan. That's why I'm apologizing. But yeah, I don't think that's clear. So I do think we have some wordsmithing.
Would it be as simple as just amending 2.1.2 to, I mean, is executive administrator term commonly used, or could we say a permanent agency, commissioner, or entity?
I mean, I think the issue here is if it were a new agency, it would be a secretary. We don't want to indicate a preference, like it isn't necessarily going to be a secretary. It might be a director. It might, like, there are a lot of technical terms. So we're just trying to delineate that there is the transition director responsible for the logistics side of how the transition happens. And then the new leader, however we refer to it, is actually that the leader that takes over the reins and implements and leads the new entity.
Senator Baumgartner.
Well, I'll just add 2 little cents worth. Part of the confusion is we're talking at the beginning part. So those 2.1 parts are once it's in place. And then when we transition to the next page, we're talking about the process. So we might need to kind of change that grouping because we're talking transition logistics rather than really once it was formed what it would be. So there's that.
I think you're right. I think we picked that up in 2.2.1.1 on Thursday. No, okay. I think it needs like a little preface sentence there during the enactment period.
Yes.
On 2.2, maybe.
Yeah.
Something like that.
My other point is kind of dovetailing what Sarah Bloom had said. And so going back to that bottom of the next page, the 2.5.6, it's not just the transition director that has to be held accountable. I don't know how many of you have ever been involved in mergers or takeovers, but an existing secretary, an existing commissioner, all kinds of folks can sandbag a process. And so it really is I think we need to expand who's going to be held accountable. Because if we have a group of folks that would be realigned from one agency, if that secretary or agency director is not making sure that we're all in this together, you're just going to be in a different team. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to sandbag the process, and it has to be made abundantly clear that there are other cabinet members that have to be held accountable as well. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, Secretary Sand.
I don't know if you'd consider this as a little amendment to that, but maybe just the word should be held accountable for managing the transition process, and the rest of that becomes part of a natural pulling people together, getting the right secretary, the right people on the bus. Managing would include raising a flag if things are not going as planned to whoever they report to, if that's the governor it is. So I would make a motion to add that word in there to perhaps better clarify what accountable means for that position.
Yes, Secretary Howard.
Also, to Senator Baumgartner's point, in section 2.5.2, where it talks about each current state agency should identify relevant program leadership, could also build some language in there that each current state agency shares accountability for this transition and shall da 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 da. So making sure that it's clear that accountability is shared.
The secretary has a different talent. Wordsmithing, thank you.
I like that. That's good.
I think that does satisfy the concern I had with the original language. So I think that's great.
Coming together, perfect. Any other questions or comments?
I have my hand. Is there a motion on the table? Do we need to do anything with that?
Would it help if
I think that Senator Petty has her hand.
I just wanted to follow up with the discussion that was going on about the layout of our presentation here. So are we talking about then potentially moving 2.5 to be instead 2.3 and then readjusting from there so that the reference to the transition director would come before the actual a discussion about, information about the person that, well, it would say it's located in executive branch, but the discussion of, the information about the transition director would come earlier. So we talked about this, but are we actually saying we want to move it?
I think if I heard correctly, there was a concern that, well, I think Monica, maybe I'm making up my own story here, but what I thought I heard you say is that as a work group, you started from the final phase and worked backwards. And so perhaps the recommendations are written as such because you started at the end and worked your way back. And that might be causing some of the confusion in terms of title and placement or whatnot. And so maybe, Senator Petty, that makes sense that maybe we move some things around so that it actually follows the order of, okay, now we're going to talk about how we make this happen, and we're going to, the legislature is going to start, and then we're going to get a transition person, and then we end up at the end talking about whoever this administrator is. And so maybe that makes sense then, and why it looks as it does, because we started at the end and worked our way backwards, but that could be causing some confusion, especially regarding title. So that might make sense.
So we're talking about flipping 2.3 and 2.5's placement in the document?
And even 2.1, where it starts with the admin who won't be hired until after the transition.
Oh, it couldn't be all of 2.1 because that's the beginning.
No, it couldn't be, but 2.1.3.
Well, 2.1 is kind of a total summary at the beginning, whereas 2.5 speaks specifically about the responsibilities and the work of the transition director. I think 2.1 could stay the same as could 2.2, but then it appears to me that the 2.5 and there should be 2.5 should be come, as you said, 2.3, and then no, 2.5 should be 2.4 should become 2.3, 2.5 should become 2.4, and 2.3 should become 2.5.
Could I make a recommendation? And Dan, I don't know if you'd be willing to, I think we could leave it up to your expertise just to put it in order of how things would transition and then the ultimate create or realignment, whatever word you want to use, to the agency of the services. But I would leave that up to you to put it in order.
That would.
And I'm fine with that.
And then I think we still have outstanding for the 2.5.6 with Secretary Standing first speaking and then Secretary Howard wordsmithing it. I really liked the idea of cleaning it up, and I like what Secretary Howard mentioned. I don't know, friendly amendment, forget what there was a women.
Would it help for me to, if we're at the end of the section, I don't want to cut off conversation on the section, but I can sort of summarize the changes that we've discussed throughout the section. Would that work? All right. So first, I think to Representative Waymaster's point, I think we are asking the group to give me some technical authority to do a little bit of wordsmithing. First, in that 2.1.2, just to make very clear that we're not talking about the transition director there. We're talking about the permanent ongoing leader of whatever this entity will be, either a secretary if it were a new agency, or whoever the permanent leader would be. In 2.2, and before I leave that topic, so also throughout we're going to make technical changes to minimize the use of the word consolidated or consolidation, so as not to confuse with the model of governance, and we will use that unified early childhood entity language in place of consolidated. In 2.2, Representative Waymaster, weigh in on whether this is appropriate, but I had noted here that maybe during that, the first bullet on 2.2, that maybe we amend that to say enactment period, legal authorization, and potential FY24 budget amendment. Right? Is that where that the
Actually,
amendment
that
would
was
take place?
under 2.3.
But just in terms of looking at the timeline that's outlined in 2.2, wouldn't that be part of that?
It'd be pertinent, yeah.
January. So maybe we added just a reference there to a potential budget amendment.
Would it be possible to do an on or before? So if it didn't happen as an amendment, maybe it rolls over into the next budget?
Yeah.
Okay.
In what is currently 2.3, but maybe renumbered, that we would reference the possibility of an FY24 budget amendment to provide seed funding that could get the process moving earlier. In accordance with that, under 2.5, I would recommend that where it says the governor's office should hire a transition director beginning July 1st, that we say maybe no later than July 1st, and that way, if assuming there's a budget amendment, that could be done sooner.
How about the same on or before language?
On or before, yep. Okay. In 2.5.6, we're going to amend the second sentence that says the transition director should be held accountable for, and then inserting the word managing the transition process, and then tacking an additional, actually, no, that's not an additional sentence there. We will add an additional sentence to 2.5.2 that suggests that each current state agency will share accountability for a successful transition. And I think that's it.
So thank you so much from my brain. Thank you for going over all of that. Did that capture all of the recommended changes that were noted? So first, I guess we will have a motion to accept the changes that Dan has presented. So do I have a motion to accept those changes?
I move Dan's balloon amendment.
Perfect.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Okay, so we need to vote on the full recommendation, I guess. So we're good. We're good. Okay, yes, we can be done with that. Yes. Okay, so perfect. And so last, we're going to hear from about the recommendations from the metrics and data work group, and Kelly Davidoff is going to provide that summary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, our work group met and had some really robust conversation about how to think about and how to measure the success that we want to see. And just as a sort of reflection to kick us off, I would share how much I valued and how important it was that our entire work group was very much centered on what we want to see for success for young children, their families, their caregivers, and the communities that they live in. And that really helped guide our thinking, even as we were talking about, sort of behind the scenes, what we wanted to see for success, and then sort of the forward facing, in front of the curtain, if you will, measures of success that we wanted to see. And all that to underscore, the idea that what gets measured gets prioritized, and just to solidify how important it is to have the right metrics. So with that, I'm happy to share the recommendations for metrics and data. Recommendation 3.1. While it may be challenging to judge success and efficiency, the following series of metrics should be used as benchmarks to determine whether the consolidated entity is having positive impacts for children, families, providers, and communities. Where relevant, all metrics should capture demographic information to allow for the tracking of equitable access across the early childhood system. So diving into 3.1.1, for child care subsidy, the consolidated entity should track the number of families receiving child care assistance, the time it takes for a family to become enrolled in child care assistance, the number of providers enrolled to accept child care assistance or subsidy, the time it takes for a provider to become approved to accept child care subsidy, the time families or providers must wait to speak to a representative to receive enrollment or other technical assistance, and the number of times families or providers must contact the consolidated entity to attempt to enroll in child care assistance. Moving into 3.1.2, for childcare licensing and availability, the consolidated entity should track the number of licensed childcare slots in the state or capacity, the number of licensed childcare facilities in the state. Sorry, we have a long list. The supply and demand of childcare slots in the state, the number of childcare facilities opened and closed, the time it takes for a provider or facility to become licensed and fully operational, the number of childcare license applications received, the number of childcare closures, the number of digital fingerprinting locations across the state, and the time between receiving fingerprints and results of a background check. Recommendation 3.1.3 focuses on the early childhood workforce and recommends that the consolidated entity should track the median wage of childcare workers, the number of individuals working in the early childhood field, and specifically in licensed childcare facilities, the retention rate of childcare workers in licensed facilities, the educational attainment of licensed childcare providers, the number of childcare providers who attain a higher level of career progression in the field following their initial employment status and type of progression, the number of post-secondary students enrolled in an early childhood education program in Kansas, the number of post-secondary students engaged in early childhood-related practicums or on-the-job training opportunities. 3.1.4 addresses home visiting programs and recommends that the consolidated entity track the number of children and families participating in a home visiting program, the number of home visits in which a child and family participates, the number of different funding streams utilized for home visiting programs. 3.1.5 highlights recommendations for metrics for business and industry. And recommends that the consolidated entity collaborate with the Department of Commerce specifically to track the number of businesses providing direct childcare or providing financial assistance for childcare to their workforce, the number of businesses inquiring for state support in the development of childcare opportunities for their workforce, and the number of businesses building childcare into their economic development plans when entering incentive negotiations with the states. And then lastly, the amount of additional state incentives provided to businesses who include childcare into the economic development plans when those incentive packages are negotiated. Recommendation 3.1.6, to determine operational success and efficiency. The consolidated entity should ensure childcare assistance payments can be made by the entity on day one. Ensure payroll is operational and accurate on day one. Ensure that IT systems are fully prepared and operational on day one. Ensure the public has access to the entity and is aware of its existence on day one. 3.1.7 identifies other general metrics that the consolidated entity should track, including the number of children enrolled in a pre-K program, kindergarten readiness, the number of children under 5 years old who die, the number of children under 5 years old entering the child welfare system, and the amount of federal funding Kansas currently pulls down for early childhood programs. I really was not lying when I said we had robust conversation about all of the things that we should measure. There are a few other recommendations that I will highlight as well. 3.2, to achieve efficiency and success, the consolidated entity should implement a robust consumer assistance program targeted towards families and providers to provide technical and operational support for their progression through the licensing process and or child care assistance programs, and specifically that this program should be adequately staffed to ensure personal connection and access to individuals at the entity. Recommendation 3.3 is that Kansas should consider the creation of a single website for easier access to the continuum of early childhood services provided to children and families. The website should include an online enrollment portal that allows families to easily determine which types of state programs and assistance for which they should qualify, and specifically that this website should be easily navigable and accessible to all Kansans regardless of their personal background. Recommendation 3.4 is the Kansas Department of Commerce should develop intentional outreach processes to provide support to businesses in the process of providing childcare to their workforce. The department should also begin intentionally incentivizing the inclusion of childcare plans in the economic development plans created by prospective businesses looking to access the state's incentive programs. And recommendation 3.4.1 is that the state should consider mandating the inclusion of childcare plans in these economic development plans if a prospective business attempts to access the state's incentive programs. And I think that concludes our recommendations.
All right. Brings us to discussion. Senator Dietrich.
And I was on this committee, and now that work group, and now that I've read this, I have a question. I mean, really read it as you were relating it to us. Under 3.1.2, I think maybe two bullets are this really measure the same thing. On the top of that page, it says the number of child care facilities open and closed, and then two bullets down it says the number of child care closures. Is that not the same thing?
Yes, I believe that is.
So maybe want to rework that. And then I have a question, if I might, under 3.1.4, talking about home visiting programs. So I think maybe it would be helpful if we had another bullet there, because we don't have nearly enough, that that we look at the obstacles faced when you're unable to do a home visit. And many times it's the parent who will not let you in the house. And so if there's some obstacle that we need to identify in a way that we can work through that or with that, I think that would be important. Because we all believe, I think, that home visiting piece is critical, but it's not always because we're not doing it, it's because they won't let you in the house or the home. So just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I just really appreciate that comment, because I think so many times the families that need the home visits are the families that will not participate in those programs. And I want to be careful that we don't hold our staff accountable that are attempting to serve those families and being rejected because we can't really force a parent to let someone come into their home. So I did have one more question also. Under 3.1.3, the first bullet, when we look at the median wage of child care workers, are you talking about in facilities? Are you talking about home providers? Are you talking about all of them? I was just trying to kind of figure out what you're measuring there.
So if I'm reflecting on our discussion, we had talked about a couple of different ways to track that. And one of the most reliable is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which just reports on the median wage for child care workers. And I think that is inclusive of a variety of different settings and a variety of different types of roles within a child care program. But others, please feel free to add context there.
Thank you. I have a question about 3.1, and I appreciate the amount of conversation that must have gone into figuring out what went on the slate. Is the intent that we would want this new entity in whatever form it takes to measure these types of things, or is the intent to make a recommendation that these would be the measures that would be looked at? Do you know what I'm asking? Because I mean, I think, well, several suggestions have been mentioned, and I have, ones that I wondered about in each section, but I just didn't know how detailed we were wanting to be at this point, or if we were wanting it to be, we would like these types of things to be measured, and that would have to be finalized at some point.
So others, please feel free to join in as well. I think we were hoping to identify specific measurements of success to use to benchmark, to say, here's where we're currently at. And, proceeding through this process of consolidating early childhood services, actually be able to measure our success. And one of the things that I've appreciated about our work group's conversation is the focus not only on process measures, so the number of things or the more output oriented metrics, but actually focusing on outcomes as well, and trying to get at that question of whether or not anyone is better off for having done this.
Does that answer your question? Great, thank you. David?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple questions on 3.1.4. And I think the work group did a great job with all of these recommendations. I was really struck by the recommendations in 3.1.3 and just thought there might be an opportunity to strengthen the home visiting metrics by following some of the same recommendations. So could we measure the number of home visitors in the workforce? Because I think that's also an important component of our workforce. Could we also measure sort of participation in Medicaid, reimbursement for home visiting through Medicaid, just as we do for childcare subsidy up above? And then I think another measure that would be helpful is just measuring the number of children that are being screened, because that will help us understand who's being referred to for services. From a general standpoint on the data, just two considerations. One is, versus just looking at numbers, could we look at percentages of eligible populations? So we have a sense of what percentage of eligible folks are getting services versus just the number of services. And I do think, if possible, it'd be great to collect the data and report on the data in the way that we could understand who's getting service, or disaggregating data by race, ethnicity, age, and then geography, because we want to make sure that our rural communities are served. And I think that's an important goal, as looking at a continuum of services, particularly in home visiting. And then one more minor, well, I don't know minor, but one other comment that I think aligns with recommendation 3.3, and we did talk about this during the discussion, is I think the forward-facing materials, like the website that's easy to use, is wonderful. I would just maybe see if we could be explicit about also simplifying the enrollment process on the back end, so that the user-friendly portal matches with a very simplified enrollment process, and we evaluate that in all of these support programs, in childcare assistance and Medicaid, and if others touch this. So I appreciate the time.
Yes, please, Senator.
Thank you so much. Can I ask you a follow-up on that? So one of the issues that we've run into over the years is the difficulty in determining who's eligible. You only know what you know.
Right.
So do you have a thought on a better way, or Monica, do you, a better way of how we can figure out who's eligible and who's not? Or even
David does. But a lot of it's based on federal poverty level. And so if you look at the population and the federal poverty level of the population and match it with the program federal poverty level, if that is an indicator, you can do it that way. But David probably has better ways.
I was thinking the actual kids,
Yeah, I mean, I think that in this probably, I have some comments outside of maybe the scope of this task force work, but I do, and so I'm not making any recommendations. I think that there is a recognition of the role that folks providing navigation or consumer assistance, or like community health workers, could play in helping families understand this process, because it's not all intuitive. But I also think it goes to sort of the point I was trying to make with asking the agencies or requiring the agencies to look at all of their enrollment processes. Like, are the forms easy to understand? Like, we normal people don't always understand like percentages of federal poverty level based off of family counts. Like, how can we take a very intensive look at like what these enrollment forms look like for families that are interacting with them, and then for the workers that are working FQHCs or working at childcare, so that they understand them too. I mean, I think government can do a better job in simplifying processes and, making things fits on note cards that make sense. So I don't know if that answered your question, Senator, but I do think that there could be a deliberate look at how we can make the information more consumable.
Yes, certainly that piece, but also just how do we identify these children to make sure the families are aware they're eligible and get them there. That's all.
I think that's a great question. I mean, I don't know if Secretary Howard or Secretary Stanek could comment on just being able to utilize like single enrollment processes and using databases within state government for different support programs.
I'll start with just an overall comment on data, my part of my healthcare life. And I don't know that it needs to go in this document, but you bring a point up that's always a concern, and it's what is the source document to get all of this, all right? And so one would assume there would be a gap analysis done about what we can get and what we can't, okay? So there's one thing. There's no answer. Every one of these is going to be a different answer. The second answer is going to be there's going to be point in time, like the average wage in 2024 is going to be different than the average wage in 2025, but then there's going to be ongoing monthly. So, I don't know if we want to expand upon what this really means, but putting some more structure around what we're really asking for, like identifying like a table, something with those things. What's your source? Who's collecting it? And the frequency, and then where it gets reported. Do a simple form. So your question and your question align with the concerns. They look all great, but Medicaid runs into this program, the same problem. Lots of directives to collect data that's not available. So we just need to be conscious of that as we move forward. Thank you. I'll let Secretary Howard answer her end.
And I think some of it's already been said. I mean, in terms of, I think the ability to sort of optimize sort of the data matching across programs, certainly in the aggregate would give you information on, kind of the uptake in different programs based on eligibility. And it could also help, in some cases in terms of that outreach to families who may be accessing some benefits they're eligible for, but not others. So.
Okay. Madam Co-Chair, I think you had some recommendation or a recommendation as well.
A recommendation. So I'm very much a data nerd, right? So this is just right in my wheelhouse, right? But there is, and I do understand the importance and want us to be able to have something where we can look back at the end and say, okay, did what we do make a difference, right? But there's also the risk of identifying things on here that our new entity is not directly responsible for. Such as we talked about adding the home visitation and the obstacles that come from that. We don't want to create a model or a situation where people are coming and saying, okay, this didn't work, when really the parent wouldn't let us inside. It had nothing to do with the new entity not being effective. And so I'd like to make a recommendation that we add something on here that states that the entity may not be solely responsible for all of the data sets, that it's community, it's family, it's partner, and that we add, all of the groups that would be involved or whatnot in this, rather than just the entity being, we talked about accountable. I just want to be careful that we don't have accountability on things that we don't have direct responsibility for.
I get what. Mm-hmm. But somebody's got to be responsible for making the table and putting it all in there.
Right, but as we word this, it says that we're trying to determine that this entity was successful, that we're trying to gather data sets to know that the coordinated efforts, whatever that we've done I don't want to say our bad word. In whatever we've done to, I'll have to say consolidate, connect, whatever it is. So I said it, sorry, Melissa. It says that we're doing all of this to know whether or not our entity was successful. And again, when we're measuring success, but we're not directly responsible for something, that can create potentially red flags that what we've done was not a good idea when we know in the big picture it would be.
Do you have a suggestion of how you might word that and where we might place it in the document? I'm just trying to, or do you have an idea,
I'm just wondering
Dan?
if Madam Co-Chair and Secretary Stanek, if I might be able to, in some of the narrative around this, sort of spell out some of the, explain that, that these are recommendations for things that the task force believes would be beneficial to the state, but that we would need to then go through a more detailed process of identifying, individual, data sources and so on. And I think, Cornelia, we could do the same thing here with sort of nuancing some of that language before, in the introduction to this section that would explain that these aren't necessarily things that we're expecting that the entity itself would be accountable for as much as something that it would, on behalf of Kansas, be responsible for tracking. And does that make sense?
Perfect. Yeah.
Senator, I believe you had a comment as well.
Well, I think that it would be very helpful, even when we're tracking barriers to home visits.
Mm-hmm.
It's very helpful for, like, the Child Welfare Oversight Committee to hear that X number of home visits were attempted, and these were the different reasons. And for some of it, it's going to be they're no longer living at the address we were provided. They don't have a cell phone number, all of those different types of things. But the other thing that I think as we are looking at this and thinking to the future, what are those different touch points that will help us get more services to families? And it really does, when you look back again at those home visits, the maternal, infant, and early child home visits. So if the mother, while she's pregnant, actually, even if it's just one time, sees an OBGYN, if she is provided something that goes home with her about when you have this child, these are the different services that are available to you. If we just, every time we have any communication with an individual that just had a child, whatever, those are the kinds of things that will help us in that process. Yeah. And I say that because when the superintendent for the School for the Blind for our state came and testified, it was a budget hearing. He indicated to us that it really was the parents as teachers that were about the only source identifying kids with vision problems. And he suspected that there were perhaps 20 to 30% more kids with vision problems that needed to be addressed. But the only touch point for those families, it wasn't a healthcare provider, but it was a parent as teacher visit that occurred. So any person that has a touch point can help us collect this. Thank you.
Great point.
Just to follow up, I think what Dan was saying, when I look at this really good comprehensive list, and there's some really cool things that I like that we want to track, but I also have a little alarm bell going off in my head saying I'm not really sure that this entity already has programs in place to make those things happen. So are we saying new programs are going to happen that will allow us to track whether a business is providing direct child care before they get state money or those kinds of things? I mean, I just do want to soften that language because I totally look at, can the new consolidated entity make it faster to go from fingerprint to licensure? Absolutely, they should. Can they make sure that the number of businesses inquiring, about being able to provide direct child care support? Maybe that new entity can help make that happen, but do we want to hold them accountable for those numbers already? I don't know.
Good question.
I'll add just one other piece of context from our work group conversation. we were very much, as I said, focused on, what we wanted to see for children, families, their caregivers, and communities, and very much in brainstorm mode. Part of our conversation also centered around the value of taking this pretty comprehensive list of metrics and actually working it into a logic model, a theory of change to explain what we wanted to see and how we thought we might get there. And I don't know that that is necessarily, everything that the task force itself would do, but certainly a valuable activity during the transition phase itself. And to be able to connect what are some of those activities and programs and services, what are the short-term outputs and the short-term outcomes and the medium-term outcomes and the long-term outcomes. And so I think that might be something, in development, worth developing to really lay that out and connect. And if there are, some longer-term sort of population metrics on here that we've identified that are worthy of keeping on the radar, but aren't necessarily able to connect to direct activities as you shared, Betsy, maybe those are just worthy of monitoring but not holding accountable for.
I agree.
And
yes.
we're developing collaborations and strategic partnerships to say we have a piece in this, even if we're not primarily responsible.
Right.
So, and I think
I love all of it. I don't get me wrong. I think it's if we can track all of this and they all go in the right direction, we are going to be, taking names and kicking behinds. But and also Monica just pointed out 3.4, which I read like 4 times, but didn't even connect back to. We're already saying we want to develop that program so that it will happen.
Okay.
So, or Sarah, whoever, someone on this side of the table that was smarter than I was figured that out. But I think we all have the same idea, which is this is all good stuff we want to see happen, but let's just be careful that we don't create a new entity that just suddenly is like overburdened with in 12 months you have to
great comment that we want them to do good work and we don't want them to spend all of their time tracking, right?
Exactly.
Director Rooker, I think you had a comment.
I think this particular section represents one of the key reasons why the realignment is potentially so beneficial, because across each of these different types of programs and services, depending on where it lives and what the funding is that supports it, some of this is already being collected. It's not collected across the board. And I think this is part of the change management that needs to be woven into the process of unifying and realigning, because it can, unless there's a prohibition in, some federal guidance, this can be an expectation built into receiving funding, for example. So there may be programs where you are not allowed to collect certain, I don't know what metrics, but generally speaking, we can build in, if we are housed in one place, these expectations can absolutely enter into the culture of that agency and the approach taken to funding programs.
And to give us a much better overall picture of how Kansas is
and
serving
reporting
children
out
and
for
families.
sure. We are building a particular database for an unduplicated count of children receiving services across a whole universe of programs in the state. We can't actually deliver at this moment. The iteration we will be delivering gives some general perspective that we don't currently have, but we can't get to a true unduplicated count of services because we don't have enough detail from every program involved.
Thank you. I think Senator Petty has a comment or a question.
Sometimes the things I want to ask or say seem like kind of petty, but I want to say I totally agree. I think this list does encompass providing a better picture of our child care needs across the state, because we do often see many of these pieces as a legislator in different locations, but not always together. So I think this is really important. But my comment is, should it say anything in the 3.1 about that this we have benchmark there, but based on metrics that how are we going? Where's our baseline going to be on baseline? The baseline of 2024 or 2023. Some of these would be metrics we don't have anything, but if we don't have a baseline to start from, then I could see some pieces of information maybe not providing the whole picture, because somebody might say, well, how has it changed? So is that reflected here already, or is that just an assumption?
Great question.
That is a great question. No, I don't believe that we identified a particular baseline year or a point in time as the baseline. It's referred to in the broader recommendation that these are metrics that will serve as the benchmarks. But I think that's an excellent suggestion, and probably should somewhat align with the overall transition timeline so that you have the initial baseline and then can benchmark it at different points in time after that.
Great suggestion. And maybe with some planning, maybe 2024 could be used as a benchmark period. Give these agencies a chance to look at it, see if it is available. Obviously, you can't collect something that isn't available, but maybe in 3.1 saying where it says the following series of metrics should be used as benchmarks, and maybe insert where available for 2024, maybe just to add some specificity there perhaps, or if there's a better year to use as a benchmark.
Could we, if you turn back to the timeline in the transition section, I'm wondering if we use that transition year to put these processes in place so that with the date that consolidation, the realignment is completed, is listed here as July 1st, 26. So maybe 24 feels too early, but using the 25 year as establishing, like, we will have the existing data we have, that's the baseline, and we establish the procedures and protocols and all of the approaches that need to be thought through and put in place so that when this unified entity on July 1st, 26 is enacted, we're ready to go. Does that make sense to this group?
Okay. No, I think we're getting close, but Secretary Stanek, please add your comment.
A number of these are already being collected, so
Okay.
I'd start there. And to our comment about we're not going to wait to start a certain date to get things going, it's concurrent with what we're doing. So I don't want to muddy it too much, but maybe some recommendation to have something in there that, and I know we want to measure the success of the new entity, whatever that's going to be, but we also want to measure success of what we're doing now and continue to improve and make sure that we're addressing these things. So I think there needs to be some kind of call to action to add to this, that our goal is to also be measuring that concurrent with, and then subsequently transition that to the success of the new entity. I don't know how to say that today, less clumsily, but just wanted to share that because of many of those are being collected now.
That's why we have a consultant to help make this brief and effective. And I think this is a good opportunity now, Dan, for you to maybe summarize some of these recommendations. Oh, is there another comment?
I do wonder.
Oh, yes.
We have an existing needs assessment that we conduct every year under our coordinated model through our preschool development grant. And while we've got a great working draft that I don't know that we need to significantly change for what we'll be releasing next year, I do wonder about incorporating these metrics into future needs assessments. That would be seems to be a straightforward way for us to be able to assess what we currently have. And also one where I think we've got the right people around the table now to say, yep, that's something that we can do without needing to wordsmith.
Thank you, Amanda.
Our agency is coordinating that work. I would say I would ask for leadership level conversations with the agencies involved, because we have run into situations where data exists, maybe can't be shared because it's personally identifiable data, and there has been some discussion about the agreements that need to be enacted. So I would elevate to leadership level, and we can take that conversation offline.
Sounds good. All right, Dan.
Ready to summarize? So I think we're looking backward at section 2. We will add the identification of baseline data into that transition year. And then moving into section 3, as just a general comment, you'll notice that the word consolidated is littered all throughout this section. We'll clean that up and make it unified. I think in 3.1, we've talked about in that first sentence, saying, this data should be used as benchmarks first as available. And then I think maybe adding some language in there to clarify that we're not just looking at the accountability of the consolidated entity, but also to determine whether the state of Kansas writ large is meeting these obligations. In 3.1.2, there is a duplicative bullet about number of child care centers closing that we'll just blip off of that list. Under 3.1.3, the first bullet there, I think to the point that was raised about the median wage of child care workers, I'm thinking we could add a parenthetical there that says, by category as feasible. And that way, if we can separate out home-based child care providers from center-based, we would include that. We're talking about in 3.1.4, adding several new bullets, including the number of home visitors in the workforce, the success of home visiting programs in billing Medicaid for reimbursement, the number of children being screened, and then all throughout looking at opportunities to express that not just in terms of raw number, but in terms of the percentage of the eligible population being served. Also, I think to David's point, looking for opportunities for us to tease that out also by the age of children and the geography of children to make sure that those services are being delivered uniformly across the state. I think that may be all of the actual edits I have, just with the caveat that we've talked about a number of things that I think can be appropriately addressed in the narrative that kind of sets the stage for that section.
Just have a quick clarification. I had noted that we wanted to track the obstacles faced with home visits.
I'm sorry, I've got that down.
Okay.
I
just want to make sure we captured that.
Successful home visit.
Successful and unsuccessful, but attempted. Okay. One other clarification, Senator Baumgartner.
I think that Betsy had mentioned, so we're looking at 3.1, that, we're tracking this to see if there are geographic or new needs or emerging needs. Because she asked, I think you had posed that question about, we're going to collect all this data. Are we going to do anything with it? And it really is to identify, are there new needs or are there needs that are geographic in nature that need to be addressed? So we're not doing it just to collect it.
Okay. And I think there was one additional clarification related to 3.3 with relation to the website, maybe a single application or at least some effort made towards ease of use. Do we want to capture that, or is it just implied? Maybe we frame that up. Okay. Simplified the enrollment process. That's a great way to put it. Okay. We do good work as a group. You got that, Dan? So with all those, as I learned a new term today, Representative Waymaster, a balloon amendment. Would somebody be brave enough to make that motion with the balloon amendment as clarified by Dan et al.? Thank you, Senator Dietrich. Is there a second? Okay. Thank you, Representative. All right. Any further discussion? Okay. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Well, I apologize for being 9 minutes over our target end time, but I think we've done great work. And thank you so much, everybody. I think oh, there's one more. Oh, yes. Sorry. I almost jumped the gun.
I don't know
Dan.
honestly that we need to take terribly much time on it. Remember when we said we were going to leave early?
Yeah, I
Remember
did say that, didn't
So
I?
just let me just note two things that maybe you can follow up separately. If I do want to call your attention to the bottom of this document. There is a section 4 that is not related specifically to a working group, but was sort of a catch-all parking lot for us of ideas that came up throughout the work groups that maybe are not really within the direct scope of the task force's work on governance. That we had sort of contemplated maybe including, not as a formal recommendation of the task force, but to flag for policymakers that these are issues that were at least raised that they may want to consider. The other point that was on the agenda here is just that you do have a draft of the table of contents of the final report. I think you will find it fairly comprehensive. If there's anything as you look that you think is maybe missing from that, or that you want to make sure is reflected in the final report, please feel free to drop me a note, and we'll make sure we get that in there. I think our next, the next planned meeting of the group is on December 11th. That morning, I believe at 10 a.m.
That's correct.
The hope is, just in terms of next steps, at that meeting, we would expect that the governor will be present to accept the final report from the group. We are going to go off based on your recommendations today and really hammer away as quickly as possible on the draft of the final report, recognizing it's going to be lengthy, it's going to take some time to design as well. So I anticipate having a draft of that back to you hopefully within the next 2 weeks. So that you can weigh in, and then we can work on getting that prettied up in advance of that meeting on December 11th.
I have a quick
Yes.
question regarding number 4. Could somebody help me understand what the third bullet means? And then I have a follow-up.
The third bullet relates to a cost-sharing model that is happening now in a number of different states. This was introduced initially in Michigan, and in Michigan is called TriShare, and so it's known well across the country at this point. North Dakota has enacted a similar project. North Carolina has just included it in its budget. Kentucky is doing it as well. But basically, it's a three-legged stool, basically, a cost sharing for childcare, which parents would pay a third, their employers would pay a third, and then the state would match the employer's contribution.
Thank you. I remember our discussion. So maybe we want to put cost share for childcare in there. And then also to the chairs, I'd just like to note on those last, on number 4, I think those are really critically important parts and pieces. While they may be outside of our purview, I think they're really important to the discussion. They don't fit nicely in any category, but I hope that we will make those part of the recommendation procedures or policy or whatever we're sending, key pieces.
So is that an additional recommendation we need to vote on today?
Is everyone comfortable with? I mean, it might not be a bad plan to, if we're gonna include them as sort of,
If we're going to do 1 through 3,
other topics, but they just to be clear, they will not be kind of formal recommendations from the task force, at least as we've envisioned.
Okay, these are additional ideas, and okay, yes, Director Rooker.
I actually was curious about overall framing. So this fits into that. So we're talking about how we frame these other ideas. So you're suggesting there would be some narrative added to explain not formal recommendations, but
not within the direct governance scope of the task force's work, but that these were important ideas that were brought up in the context that the task force would encourage the governor and the legislature to take under advisement.
To consider or take a look at them. I think that's important. And then I just want to visit, we received an outline, kind of the table of contents for the overall report. It looks to me like there will be some sections that frame the why this is necessary, because these recommendations are very much what and how, but making sure this report includes why this matters and frame it appropriately. Is that what I read in those sections?
You read into this. If you look, you'll see that recommendations is one section down sort of near the bottom of this. So there will be there'll be introductory letters from Sam and Cornelia as the co-chairs, an introductory letter from the governor, background information. I mean, we will set this up for readers who are coming to this conversation fresh, drawing in part on some of the background materials that you've already received throughout this process, sort of setting up, different states have taken different approaches and kind of what got us to this point.
Yes, sir. So in December, will we be reviewing as a group this final report, or are you planning on just emailing that out?
I think my expectation is that you will receive the final report by email, and there will be a period for kind of final. I do think I don't know if we've talked about sort of a final adoption of the report, but I think the hope would be that is sort of a formality by that December meeting, that you will have had an opportunity to read, review, comment, and
it won't be sent out before December 11th to.
It won't be sent out to the public before December 11th. December 11th will be sort of the official roll.
Perfect. Thank you.
So going forward on our next meeting, I will not state that you will possibly get out early. So that will not happen. And so, yes, so with all that being said, thank you for transparency, for the conversation, for honestly the collaboration space, especially with our agency heads here. And this really does spell out everything that we're working towards and what we're doing. And it's actually quite a privilege to be part of this conversation. And if we can really check the boxes of everything that we identified here in terms of metrics that show success, my God, we would no longer be like number 49, right? And so that would not happen. It would be absolutely amazing. So thank you all very much for being here. Thank you again for your participation. And we'll see you on December 11th.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.